Welcome to Asia Pacific Defense Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. I'm recording this podcast from my room in Beijing at the end of, I think it's a 12-day visit to China, the bulk of which I've spent in Xinjiang, and more of that later on. There's probably nothing that would show that this is being recorded in Beijing. There's no distinctive background noise, but I thought I'd do it nevertheless while things are still fresh in my mind. Now, I still have to battle with VPN problems, so if you're hearing this, it means that I've succeeded. Now, despite the punishing schedule in Xinjiang, long days, 8 days straight, no time off, I've still kept an eye, or tried to keep an eye, on a few things happening in Australia and the outside world, and there's some noteworthy stuff. The first thing worth mentioning is the government announcement of $12 billion of funding to expand the Henderson shipbuilding and ship maintenance precinct in Western Australia. And I would say that investment in infrastructure, defence infrastructure, is welcome and necessary, but it doesn't add that much to Australia's military capabilities. It's just lots of concrete being poured. It's not that we're getting extra bullets or extra aircraft or anything like that. Anyway, it's a necessary thing, so I'm glad that it's going ahead. However, the $12 billion, the numbers are clearly shaky there. One interpretation when I read through the ministerial stuff is that the funding for the landing craft medium project is included as part of that $12 billion. Now, that would be a clear case of double counting. And another thing I noticed is that the subsequent inquiries from journalists indicate that the government is hoping that there will be some private sector funding involved. So the whole thing all sounds a bit shaky, and certainly nothing like the $12 billion that the government trumpeted, and as usual, the reality is rather less exciting than the rhetoric. Now, a genuinely piece of exciting, excellent news was the selection of Ghost Shark, the large, uncrewed underwater vessel produced by Anduril, or I should emphasize, by Anduril's Australian subsidiary. The work is being done here. It's being done by Australians. I guess by now the company is at plus 300 people. So this is a very welcome development, and I'm sure the company will be happy with the $1.7 billion. As regular listeners know, I have long held the view that autonomous systems enabled with AI are the way of the future. I believe in the underwater domain, they will soon dominate, and crewed submarines will become progressively less useful. Now, while all of the focus has been on Ghost Shark and what it can or can't do, people might wish to be aware that in the US, the parent Anduril company has developed two distinct types of weaponized kamikaze uninhabited underwater vehicles, roughly the same size as a Mark 54 lightweight torpedo, and also the other one is similar to a Mark 48 heavyweight torpedo. These are known for marketing terms as part of the Copperhead family, and the thought occurs that a Ghost Shark armed with a few anti-submarine warfare torpedoes would be a truly formidable combination. It might be that ultimately the only submarines where you need people on board are the huge nuclear missile-firing SSBNs, the ultimate nuclear deterrent. I would argue that you would always want humans to be making final decisions about what might end all life on the planet, though I suppose that depends on the quality of the human being making the decisions. Anyway, this will make Australia's AUKUS nuclear-powered submarines a very expensive and not particularly useful luxury. Let me put it this way. With uninhabited systems evolving so rapidly, what are the actual missions that a crewed nuclear-powered submarine can perform that a swarm of armed undersea drones could not? Class, any ideas? The only mission I can think of is landing and recovering special forces personnel, and that's actually a very small part of what submarines are designed to do. And on that topic, by the way, I see that Australia's two heads of state, not many people are aware that we have two heads of state, but we do. One of them is President Donald Trump from the United States, and the other is Britain's King Charles. They both have had a chat about AUKUS while they were yucking it up at Windsor Castle, and I'm sure they will tell Australia what the result is in due course. I can hardly wait to hear what they have decided for us. And I'm not surprised that the UK is pushing hard for AUKUS, because they need our money. If the thing falls apart, I very much doubt that the UK, unaided, would be able to fund their next generation of attack submarines by themselves. They need Australia. They need our money. So no wonder the King was enthusiastic about the deal. The attitude of Donald Trump, we don't know. What else? Defence pact with Papua New Guinea. Well, that's all come apart. Originally, when it was announced, again, it sounded like a move in the right direction, but that's fallen through with no signing of the document taking place. It hasn't been ratified by the Papua New Guinea Parliament, so one wonders what is actually going on there. The week before, another deal with Vanuatu fell through. It's not a very good track record, is it? I mean, they might go ahead. A lot of people say, well, they're just, a couple of spelling errors in the paperwork. It'll all be fine. I don't know. But at a high level, the problems look actually fairly simple to me. And there are two major differences between Australia and the Pacific nations that might have got in the way of both of these agreements. Now, many of the small Pacific Island countries see climate change as number one priority. Australia makes polite noises about the problem, but policy is not particularly convincing, despite some recent announcements by the government. And the second one is Australia sees China as a direct threat to the area, but Pacific Island nations are far more ambivalent and want to be able to work with both. It doesn't surprise me, given the rate of growth in the Chinese economy. I'll be coming to that hopefully in a while. And in addition to that, I'm not sure Australia clinging to the US in the era of Trump helps either. Anyway, as I say, both these agreements could come at any time, though I'm mildly surprised that the minister responsible, Pat Conroy, hasn't received any stick, because as well as being Defence Industry Minister, he's also Minister for Pacific Island Affairs. And the last time I checked, both Vanuatu and New Guinea are, in fact, Pacific Islands. Defence Minister Richard Marles has also made a big deal about swanning around the region repeatedly, so he doesn't look good out of all of this. And finally, nor does Foreign Minister Penny Wong. It really looks like amateur hour. Now, I'll come to China, and I'll start with a disclaimer and explanation, which I normally wouldn't do, except the topic of China has a tendency to bring out the worst in some people. I was offered a media tour to Xinjiang about 2 months ago with a vague agenda and thought, well, why not? Because I've always been interested in the geopolitics of Central Asia, since what happens there has consequences for the rest of the world, including Australia. And I want to make it clear, after leaving Canberra, my 11-hour economy-class overnight flight from Melbourne to Beijing was completely full, and I was stuck down the back for the duration. This was followed by a 5-hour wait, sitting in a coffee shop at Beijing Airport, trying to do some work, and then a 4.5-hour flight to Urumqi, the capital of the Xinjiang Autonomous region. The hotels for the 8-day tour, I mentioned there were no breaks. Every day had a completely packed program, meant staying in reasonable budget places. They are the sorts of places I prefer when I'm travelling alone, because I don't like wasting money on anything fancy, and when I'm just after something that has a bed and a functioning bathroom. By the way, there are still many, many people in China who would regard that level of accommodation as being luxurious. I'm saying by Australian standards, it wasn't. It was just good working level stuff. The food was okay. almost always buffets back at the hotel. Now, the reason why I'm labouring this point is that I'm about to say some things that might upset listeners, particularly concerning Uighurs, and so I want to say something at the very start. Namely, if anyone thinks I have been bought by the Chinese government and have been somehow wined and dined, they are totally wrong. In fact, for the tour, there was no alcohol served, which for people who know me well is a bit unusual. So let me be completely clear. This was a no-frills working trip. And so people can understand where my analysis is coming from, I'll go a bit further. This is the lens through which I view China. And my summary is this. China is an authoritarian one-party state that has little to no tolerance for dissent. Since 1978, the country has experienced an enormous economic transition, possibly the greatest in world history, particularly given its speed, that has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty and given them decent lives. China has now an excellent education system, almost free healthcare. People pay a minimum of $100 a year, and the state covers at least 60% of all of the expenses. It also features some of the world's best infrastructure, such as an extensive high-speed rail network. And China remains the world's factory, making just about everything. The economy faces a number of structural problems with an aging population and declining birth rate, kind of high on the list. On the military side of things, I remain concerned at the speed with which China is increasing military capabilities, particularly the naval build-up, which is huge. I worry about the number of cyber attacks emanating from China. However, I do not believe that China is an existential threat to Australia or that war is inevitable, though it could certainly break out over a miscalculation or have an accidental cause, or we could be dragged into it by the US, particularly with Donald Trump acting like an orangutan on some extremely bad acid. I'm also very concerned about China's alignment with Russia and North Korea. Now, all of these things I've just touched on were way outside the scope of the media tour. I would say that what is needed is more transparency from China about the intentions of the build-up, but coming from Australia, one of the least transparent and secretive government sectors in the world, I don't want to insult the intelligence of listeners or indeed insult the Chinese. Oh, another comment about, state control of media, which happens here, and stamping out dissent. While I was away on Thursday, June the 11th, the ABC ran a report supposedly about AUKUS and the $8 billion being spent at HMAS Sterling that comprised interviewing 3 AUKUS boosters: Vice Admiral Meade, the head of the submarine agency; Jennifer Parker, an ex-Navy commentator who is at the extreme end of the pro-AUKUS fan club; and ditto Andrew Hastie from the coalition. This sort of lopsided commentary with everyone singing from the same song sheet would make the Chinese Communist Party blush. Okay, now that I've gotten that off my chest, I'll continue. And again, let me say before we get into the details of the media trip, it was very structured, but we were all free to wander around and speak with whoever we wanted to. There were no problems wandering off and exploring the streets by ourselves of Urumqi, Kashgar, or Ili. We weren't supervised. We weren't followed, or at least if we were, we didn't know about it, and there was never much security on display. Now, I'm sure that security was an issue because of concerns about Islamic extremism, but it was very much in the background, and in fact I found the security here in the capital, Beijing, to be far heavier and quite unpleasant. I'll just say, just in the first few hours of walking around here to the tourist spots, I had to show my passport 3 times, and it can get even worse with police doing spot checks on anyone they don't like the look of, which I saw happening a few times. It reminds me of the failed attempt by Mike Pezzullo as head of Border Force in 2015 to inflict random checks on the citizens of Melbourne. Papers, please. Papiere bitte, the hallmark of the Gestapo in Nazi Germany. And by the way, that's the way Trump's America is going, with immigration raids. Oh, there's a minor discrepancy on your documents. Oh, you don't look exactly like your photo. So how about 2 weeks in the cells while we sort that out? Given my dislike of petty bureaucracy, I wouldn't last long here because it's one of my top 3 hates, coming a distant third after leaf blowers, for which I have a pathological hatred, and cruelty to animals on top of the list. So with that disclaimer, for a couple of minutes remaining, let's talk about Xinjiang. Did I speak with all 26 million inhabitants, half of whom are Uighur and half are Chinese? There are small numbers of other ethnic groups there as well. Did I visit every factory in the autonomous region, which is about the size of Queensland? No, I did not, but I can still make a few observations. The visit had 2 interlinked components: the Belt and Road Initiative, the huge economic project, and the treatment of Uighur people, both topics of some controversy, and because of time limits, I'm going to canter through the main issues. And I've collected so much hard data on this trip that I will do a special midweek bonus podcast, possibly 2, just about the visit to Xinjiang, so those of you who are really interested in China might wish to keep an eye open for that. Now, one of the things that is often left out of the coverage of what is happening with the Uighur people is the shocking levels of extreme violence that Islamic militants inflicted on Xinjiang between the early 2000s and about 2016. One of the highlights or lowlights of the visit was going to the sort of a terrorism information center in Urumqi that was almost stomach-turning in the violence, the graphic violence that was being shown through security camera videos, police videos, photographs, all of that sort of thing. Violence that led to the death of hundreds, probably thousands of people in dozens of attacks over a number of years. These were mainly innocent women and children, but also police officers. Now, if anyone dares say to me that, oh, look, that's all fake news, I used to live on a farm, and unfortunately I've shot enough things to tell the difference between something real and something that is not. Now, almost none of this has ever been covered in Australia, even though China says it always released information about what was taking place. So I'm running out of time, but because I'm going to deal with sort of the Uighur crackdown, which I suspect it is still taking place. Not sure about the extent of it, but I would argue that this started off for very good reasons. And also ask the question, why, as the Chinese do, why these things have not been covered in Australia. And for a moment, let's compare this with the current matter of Charlie Kirk, the right-wing stirrer who was killed in the United States last week. I barely know who this guy is, and these days I watch US politics closely. His death is now being used by Trump and his associates to further crack down on free speech, something that China is correctly accused of. And I see that even comedian Jimmy Kimmel, a persistent critic of Trump, has been yanked off the air because he dared say that the shooter might not have been a left-wing radical. Well, so much for the First Amendment and the right to free speech in the US. Things are now so bad you can't even tell a joke. This is becoming like Thailand, where soon people will be jailed for speaking ill of the king or even making jokes about him. The king, in this case, I'm referring to Donald Trump. And our politicians continue to slobber all over US boots, and I wonder, do any of them read a newspaper? I'm going to conclude with the thought that I'm not sure it's a positive one. It depends where you stand on the Uyghur issue. We saw a lot of Uyghur communities. I'm aware that Uyghurs have their own television station, their own newspapers, their own bulletins. It seems that their culture is being respected. So I think we can be reasonably convinced that there is no cultural genocide taking place. Repression, that's another topic, a touchy one, and I will explore that in more detail next time. Thank you very much for listening. A goodbye from Beijing, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.